Margaret's laptop screen cast a blue glow across her darkened kitchen as she settled in for what promised to be an illuminating evening. Her wine glass sat forgotten beside a stack of printed documents that would have made most people's blood run cold. FBI background check templates, federal database access protocols, and a secure login page that required biometric authentication. She pressed her thumb to the laptop's scanner and watched as layers of security clearance peeled away. Like digital onion skins, NCIC, FinCEN, the Treasury's financial crimes database, resources that most law enforcement officers could only dream of accessing, were at her fingertips. Being the FBI director had its privileges. "Let's see what you're hiding, Mr. Hawthorne," she murmured, typing his full name into the search field. The initial results were disappointingly mundane. Richard James Hawthorne, born 1962. Married to Patricia Ann Hawthorne, née Morrison. No criminal record, credit score of 751. He worked as a senior project manager for Kellerman and Associates, a government contracting firm that specialized in IT infrastructure for federal agencies. Clean driving record, modest mortgage, 2 adult children living in other states. On the surface, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be. A middle management bureaucrat living out his final working years in suburban anonymity. But Margaret had learned long ago that the most dangerous predators were often the ones who looked the most normal. She dug deeper, pulling up financial records that painted a more interesting picture. Hawthorne's salary at Kellerman and Associates was $87,000 annually, yet his checking account showed regular deposits that were significantly larger. Cash deposits, always under the $10,000 reporting threshold, made every 2 weeks like clockwork. "Interesting," Margaret said aloud, taking notes on a legal pad. "Someone's supplementing their income." A deeper dive into Kellerman and Associates revealed that the company held several lucrative contracts with Homeland Security and the Defense Department, providing cybersecurity consulting and data management services, the kind of work that dealt with sensitive information and required high-level security clearances. Margaret's phone rang, startling her from her concentration. Deputy Director Williams's name appeared on the screen. "I thought you were taking the weekend off," Williams said without preamble. "I am. This is purely recreational research." "Recreational research involving federal databases at 11:30 on a Saturday night? Margaret, what did you do?" She summarized the afternoon's encounter with Hawthorne and the subsequent police visit, keeping her tone light and professional. But Williams knew her well enough to read between the lines. "Jesus Christ, Margaret. You can't use bureau resources for a neighbor dispute." "I'm not using bureau resources," she said, which was technically true. She was using director-level resources, which were arguably different. "I'm conducting a routine background check on someone who may pose a security risk to a federal official." "That's the biggest load of bullshit I've heard all week, and I just spent Friday in budget meetings with congressional staff." Margaret smiled despite herself. "Tom, this man called the police on me for wearing a bathing suit. That level of irrational behavior suggests either mental instability or underlying criminal activity. Given that he works for a defense contractor with access to classified information, I'd say a security review is warranted." There was a long pause. "What did you find?" "Unexplained income, regular cash deposits that don't match his salary, and his employer handles cybersecurity for some very sensitive government systems." Williams sighed. "Margaret, promise me you're not going to do anything stupid." "I'm going to do what I always do. Follow the evidence wherever it leads." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." "Look, if you genuinely think there's a national security issue here, bring it through proper channels on Monday. Don't go all vigilante on some suburban asshole just because he pissed you off." After Williams hung up, Margaret stared at her laptop screen for a long moment. He was right, of course. She was letting personal feelings cloud her professional judgment. But something about Hawthorne's behavior earlier had triggered every instinct she'd developed in 20 years of hunting criminals and terrorists. The Man wasn't just a racist neighbor. He was hiding something. She was about to close the laptop when an email notification popped up. A secure message from the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division, flagging suspicious activity on an account registered to R.J. Hawthorne. The system had automatically cross-referenced her database search with ongoing investigations. Margaret's pulse quickened as she opened the file. For the past 6 months, FinCEN had been tracking a money laundering operation that used small, regular deposits to move funds through dozens of accounts across the D.C. area. The pattern was sophisticated, amounts small enough to avoid reporting. Requirements, timing irregular enough to avoid detection algorithms, but with a consistency that suggested systematic organization. Richard Hawthorne's account had been flagged as a potential node in the network 3 weeks ago. "Son of a bitch," Margaret whispered, leaning back in her chair. Her racist neighbor wasn't just an asshole. He was potentially part of an active federal investigation. She picked up her phone and called the duty officer at the Financial Crimes Division. Special Agent Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, answered on the second ring. "Agent Chen, this is Director Chen. I need an update on the Hawthorne account in the FinCEN money laundering investigation." "Director? It's midnight on a Saturday." "I'm aware of the time. The Hawthorne account. What's the current status?" Margaret could hear papers rustling in the background. "Richard James Hawthorne, Fairfax County address. Account was flagged 3 weeks ago as part of a larger pattern analysis. We've been monitoring but haven't initiated direct surveillance yet. The case agent is planning to approach him for a voluntary interview next week." "Who's the case agent?" "Special Agent Morrison, working out of the D.C. field office." Margaret made a note to contact Morrison first thing Monday morning. "Any indication of what organization might be behind the money laundering?" "Still developing leads, but the pattern suggests either Russian organized crime or a domestic fraud operation. The amounts are too small for cartel money, too systematic for individual tax evasion." After she hung up, Margaret sat in her darkened kitchen, pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to take shape. Hawthorne's aggressive behavior toward her suddenly took on a different cast. Had it been simple racism, or had he been trying to drive away a neighbor whose professional background might pose a threat to his illegal activities? She thought about his job at Kellerman and Associates, his access to government systems, his unexplained income. If he was laundering money for foreign operatives while holding a security clearance, her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted text from Agent Morrison. "Director, got word you're asking about the Hawthorne case. Are you personally involved?" Margaret stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. "Potentially. Need to brief you on some developments. Can you meet tomorrow? Sunday? This must be big. Bigger than you think. And Tom? Bring everything you have on Kellerman and Associates." As she finally closed her laptop and headed upstairs to bed, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her peaceful weekend had just become the opening move in a much more dangerous game. Hawthorne had made a critical error when he'd tried to intimidate her. He'd revealed himself to someone with both the resources and the authority to destroy him. But as she drifted off to sleep, Margaret couldn't know that 3 blocks away, Richard Hawthorne was making an encrypted phone call to a number registered in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, speaking in rapid, nervous Russian about his new neighbor who asked too many questions and didn't seem intimidated by police visits. The woman he'd tried to humiliate for wearing a bathing suit was about to become the most dangerous threat his organization had ever faced. And by morning, the stakes would escalate far beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. The hunter had become the hunted, but neither predator nor prey yet understood just how deadly this particular game was about to become. The encrypted phone in Richard Hawthorne's basement office rang at 3:17 a.m., jolting him from uneasy sleep. He stumbled down the stairs in his pajamas, his heart hammering against his ribcage as he recognized the distinctive ringtone that meant Moscow was calling. "Da," he answered in Russian, his voice hoarse with sleep and fear. "Richard." The voice belonged to Dmitry Volkov. his handler for the past 8 years. Even through the digital encryption, Volkov's displeasure was unmistakable. "We have a problem." Hawthorne's mouth went dry. He'd been dreading this call since yesterday afternoon, when his simple plan to intimidate his slutty neighbor had spiraled completely out of control. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where federal databases start lighting up with queries about our most valuable asset in Virginia." Volkov's English was perfect, flavored only with the faintest trace of a Moscow accent. "Tell me, Richard, what exactly did you do to attract the attention of the FBI?" "I don't know what you're talking about." The lie came automatically, but even as he spoke the words, Hawthorne knew it was useless. The Russians had sources everywhere, including, apparently, inside federal law enforcement systems. "Don't insult my intelligence." At 11:43 p.m. last night, someone with director-level access ran a comprehensive background check on you. Financial records, employment history, travel patterns, everything. They also cross-referenced your account with active money laundering investigations. Volkov's voice grew colder with each word. "This level of scrutiny doesn't happen by accident, Richard. What did you do?" Hawthorne sank into his desk chair, his legs suddenly too weak to support him. For 8 years, he'd lived a careful double life. The boring suburban project manager by day, the SVR intelligence asset by night. He'd laundered millions of dollars through his accounts, passed countless classified documents to his handlers, and helped coordinate cyber attacks on American infrastructure, all while maintaining the perfect cover of middle-class mediocrity, and he'd blown it all because he couldn't stand the sight of an Asian woman in a bikini. "There was an incident with my neighbor," he began, then told Volkov everything. The confrontation by the pool, his call to the police, the woman's suspicious composure under pressure. Volkov listened in silence, and somehow that was worse. Then screaming would have been. When Hawthorne finished, there was a long pause filled only with digital static. "You called the police," Volkov said finally, "on your neighbor, because she was sunbathing." "She was being inappropriate. This is a family neighborhood and—" "Richard." The single word cut through his justification like a blade. "What do you know about this neighbor?" "Nothing." "She moved. In 2 years ago. Keeps to herself mostly. Says she's some kind of consultant. And it never occurred to you to verify that story, to run even a basic background check before engaging in a confrontation that might draw attention to yourself?" Hawthorne's silence was answer enough. "Her name is Margaret Chen," Volkov continued, "and she's not a consultant. She's the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words hit Hawthorne like a physical blow. The room spun around him, and for a moment he thought he might vomit. The FBI director. He'd called the police on the FBI director for wearing a bathing suit. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, God, oh, God, oh—" "Shut up." Volkov's voice cracked like a whip. "Panic accomplishes nothing. We need to assess the damage and formulate a response." "What kind of response? She's the FBI director. She probably already knows everything. If she knew everything, you'd be in federal custody right now, instead of having this conversation. The fact that you're still free suggests she doesn't yet understand what she's stumbled onto, but that won't last long." Hawthorne tried to think through the implications, but his mind kept circling back to the same terrifying image. Margaret Chen's calm, measured voice as she'd faced down his complaints yesterday afternoon. The way she'd stood up to him without a trace of fear or deference. He'd mistaken professional confidence for arrogance, federal authority for suburban defiance. "What do we do?" he asked. "We have 3 options," Volkov said. "We can extract you immediately. New identity, relocation to a non-extradition country, but you lose everything here, and the operation is compromised. We can attempt to eliminate the threat, but assassinating an FBI director on American soil would bring heat we're not prepared to handle. Or what? We accelerate the timeline on Blackwater Protocol." Hawthorne felt his blood turn to ice water. Blackwater Protocol was the nuclear option, the contingency plan they'd spent 5 years developing but never expected to use. It involved simultaneously activating every asset in their DC network, 23 deep cover operatives embedded in government agencies, defense contractors, and financial institutions. A coordinated intelligence grab that would net terabytes of classified data before disappearing into the digital ether. It would also burn every single asset in the process, leaving them all exposed and expendable. Dimitri, please, there has to be another way. If we trigger Blackwater, my life is over. Your life is already over, Richard. The only question is whether you take valuable intelligence with you when you fall or whether you die for nothing. The line went silent except for digital static. Hawthorne stared at his encrypted phone, realizing that 8 years of loyal service had just evaporated in the face of operational necessity. He was no longer an asset. He was a liability to be managed. Upstairs, Patricia was probably still, asleep, blissfully unaware that her husband's hobby of ethnic intimidation had just destroyed their entire life. Their grandchildren would grow up knowing their grandfather was a Russian spy. Their children would spend decades trying to distance themselves from the family name, all because he couldn't mind his own business when his neighbor decided to get some sun. "You have 12 hours to begin data extraction," Volkov said finally. "Our technical team will provide updated protocols. Gather everything you can from Kellerman's servers. Personnel files, security protocols, current project specifications. Priority items are marked in your standing orders. And then what? Then you disappear. We'll have extraction protocols ready, but I won't lie to you, Richard. Your chances of making it out of the country alive are not good. Director Chen will mobilize every resource at her disposal once she understands the scope of what she's uncovered." Hawthorne closed his eyes, seeing his entire future collapse into a single point of inevitability. "What about Patricia?" "What about her? She doesn't know anything. She's innocent in all this. Innocence is a luxury we can't afford. If she becomes a liability, she'll be handled accordingly." The threat was delivered in the same casual tone Volkov might use to discuss the weather. Hawthorne had never harbored any illusions about the ruthlessness of his Russian handlers, but hearing his wife's life dismissed so casually drove home just how thoroughly he'd destroyed everything he'd ever cared about. "I understand," he said. "Good. And Richard, if you're thinking about turning yourself in to Director Chen, about making some kind of deal to save yourself or your wife, remember that we have assets throughout the federal system. There's nowhere you can run, no protection the Americans can offer, that we can't eventually reach." The line went dead, leaving Hawthorne alone in his basement with the weight of his catastrophic mistakes. Above him, the house settled with small, creaking sounds that suddenly seemed ominous. Every shadow could hide a Russian assassin. Every phone call could be his last. He looked at his watch. 3:47 a.m. In a few hours, Margaret Chen would wake up and continue whatever investigation had prompted her to run his background. She would discover financial irregularities that would lead to surveillance footage that would reveal meetings with known intelligence operatives. The dominoes were already falling. All he could do now was try to extract as much value as possible from the wreckage of his life and hope that when the FBI finally came for him, they'd be more interested in what he could tell them than in making him disappear into a federal prison forever. But first, he had to survive the next 12 hours. And given that he'd just become a liability to one of the world's most ruthless intelligence services, survival was looking less and less likely with each passing minute. 3 blocks away, Margaret Chen slept peacefully, unaware that her racist neighbor's phone call had just triggered a chain of events that would culminate in the largest counterintelligence operation in FBI history. The game was no longer about neighborhood disputes or personal dignity. It was about national security, and the stakes had just become life and death. Margaret's morning run took her past Hawthorne's house at exactly 6:15 a.m., part of her regular 3-mile circuit through the neighborhood. What she saw made her slow to a careful jog, then stop altogether under the pretense of stretching against a lamppost. Through the kitchen window, she could see Patricia Hawthorne moving around frantically. opening cabinets and pulling out items with the urgent efficiency of someone packing for an emergency evacuation. In the driveway, Richard Hawthorne was loading suitcases into the trunk of their silver Lexus, his movements jerky and paranoid as he constantly scanned the street. Margaret pulled out her phone and pretended to check her running app while actually activating the camera. She managed to capture several clear shots of Hawthorne's license plate and the suitcases before a black SUV with tinted windows turned onto the street. Every instinct she'd developed in 20 years of federal law enforcement screamed danger. She continued her stretch routine while watching the SUV cruise slowly past the Hawthorne house, then circle the block. Professional surveillance, but not federal. She knew all the Bureau's vehicles in the D.C. area, and this wasn't one of them. Her secure phone vibrated with an encrypted message from Agent Morrison. "Emergency. Need to meet now. Hawthorne's situation has escalated beyond anything we anticipated." Margaret typed back quickly, "Hawthorne House. They're packing to run. Black SUV conducting surveillance, unknown affiliation. Jesus Christ. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. These people are extremely dangerous." The black SUV completed another slow pass, and this time Margaret got a partial view of the driver. Slavic features, professional bearing, the kind of cold assessment in his eyes that she recognized from international terrorism briefings. This wasn't local law enforcement or federal surveillance. This was something much more dangerous. She resumed her jog at a casual pace, but her mind was racing through tactical assessments. If Hawthorne was trying to flee, it meant he knew his cover was blown. If foreign operatives were conducting surveillance, it meant the stakes were exponentially higher than a simple money laundering case. And if Agent Morrison was this panicked on a Sunday morning, it meant something had happened overnight that had transformed a routine financial investigation into a national security crisis. 20 minutes later, she met Morrison at a Starbucks. In downtown Fairfax, both of them dressed in civilian clothes and speaking in the careful code of intelligence professionals in public spaces. "Tell me," she said without preamble. Morrison was a 15-year veteran of financial crimes investigations, normally unflappable, but his hands shook slightly as he opened his tablet. "At 4:30 this morning, our monitoring systems detected massive data exfiltration from Kellerman and Associates servers, terabytes of classified information, including personnel files for every employee with security clearances above secret level." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. Hawthorne? Had to be. He's one of only 12 people with administrative access to those systems. But here's the thing. The exfiltration was too sophisticated, too comprehensive for one person. This was coordinated. How coordinated? Morrison slid his tablet across the table, showing her a map of the D.C. area dotted with red indicators. Simultaneous breaches at 17 different facilities, all happening within a 6-hour window. Defense contractors, federal agencies, financial institutions. Someone activated an entire network of assets all at once. Margaret stared at the map, her blood running cold as the implications became clear. This isn't just about Hawthorne laundering money. This is a massive espionage operation, and we just stumbled into the middle of it. It gets worse. The NSA intercepted encrypted communications between several of the breach locations and known Russian intelligence facilities. This is SVR, Margaret. High-level foreign intelligence operation probably running for years. And my neighbor dispute yesterday triggered them to burn the entire network? Morrison nodded grimly. They must have realized you were on to Hawthorne and decided to extract maximum value before the whole thing collapsed. The question is, what do we do now? Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Director Chen. We need to talk. Come alone to the parking garage at Tyson's Corner Center, level B3, space 247. You have 1 hour. She showed the message to Morrison, who paled. That's not a federal number. No, it's not. Margaret stood up, her decision made. I want full tactical support positioned around Tyson's Corner, but at a distance. If this goes bad, I need backup that can respond in under 30 seconds. Margaret. You can't seriously be considering, I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and 23 Russian intelligence assets just stole classified information that could compromise every major security operation in the continental United States. Her voice was quiet, but carried the authority of someone who'd never learned to back down from a threat. I'm going to get that information back, and I'm going to roll up every single one of these bastards, starting with my racist neighbor. An hour later, Margaret stood in the dim fluorescent lighting of a shopping mall parking garage, her service weapon concealed but easily accessible, listening to the echo of footsteps approaching through the concrete maze. When Richard Hawthorne emerged from behind a concrete pillar, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Director Chen," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and fear. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Hawthorne. Or should I say, Agent Volkov's. Asset designation number 47? Hawthorne's face crumpled with defeat. "You know everything." "I know enough. What I want to know is why you asked me here instead of disappearing into whatever extraction protocol your handlers had prepared. Because they're going to kill me." The words came out in a rush, desperate and terrified. "And probably my wife, too. The moment I became a liability, I stopped being an asset and became a target." Margaret studied his face, reading the genuine terror there. "So you want to make a deal?" "I want to stay alive, and I want Patricia to stay alive. She doesn't know anything about any of this. She thinks I work late because I'm dedicated to my job. In 32 years of marriage, I've never told her the truth about what I really do. What you really do is commit treason against the country that gave you citizenship, opportunity, and a comfortable life." "Yes." Hawthorne's voice broke. "Yes, I did all of that. For money at first, and then because I was in too deep to get out. But yesterday, when you stood up to me in your backyard, I saw something I'd forgotten existed." "What's that?" "Integrity. Real integrity, not the performance of it. You weren't afraid of me, weren't trying to appease me or make me comfortable. You just stood there and told me the truth, that I was out of line, and that you wouldn't tolerate it." Hawthorne's hands shook as he spoke. "I haven't met anyone with real integrity in 8 years, Director Chen. It reminded me of who I used to be, before I sold my soul to Moscow." Margaret felt a flicker of something that might have been pity, but she crushed it ruthlessly. "Pretty words, Mr. Hawthorne, but I'm going to need more than a crisis of conscience. What can you give me?" "Everything." Hawthorne reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. "Names, locations, financial records, communication protocols, the complete structure of the SVR's East Coast network. 23 assets, their handlers, their mission objectives, everything." Margaret stared at the drive, recognizing it as potentially the most valuable counterintelligence windfall in FBI history. "Why should I trust you?" "Because in about 10 minutes, a Russian assassination team is going to realize I'm not at home, waiting to be extracted, and they're going to start hunting me. The only way I survive this is if you take down the entire network before they can regroup." As if summoned by his words, Margaret's earpiece crackled with Morrison's voice. "Director, we have 3 black SUVs converging on the mall. Unknown occupants, moving with tactical precision." Margaret looked at Hawthorne, seeing her own mortality reflected in his terrified eyes. The racist neighbor who'd called the cops on her for wearing a bathing suit was about to become the most important intelligence asset in federal law enforcement history. But first, they both had to survive the next 10 minutes. "Run," she told him, drawing her weapon as the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the parking garage. "And pray to whatever God you still believe in that I'm faster than they are." The hunt was about to begin, and this time, the FBI director wasn't just investigating a crime, she was fighting for her life. The first shot shattered the concrete pillar 6 inches from Margaret's head, sending chips of debris stinging across her cheek. She dove behind a parked minivan, her service weapon already in her hands as the parking garage erupted into chaos. "Federal agent," she shouted. knowing it was futile but following protocol, even as bullets sparked off the concrete around her. "Drop your weapons!" The response was a coordinated volley of suppressed automatic weapons fire that turned the minivan's windows into glittering confetti. These weren't the kind of operatives who surrendered to federal authority. Margaret's earpiece crackled with Morrison's voice. "Director, tactical teams are 60 seconds out. We have 6 hostiles. Professional-grade equipment, unknown casualties." "Negative. Casualties so far," Margaret replied, low-crawling toward better cover as Hawthorne scrambled behind a concrete support column 20 feet away. But these bastards came prepared for war. Through the garage's entrance, she could see muzzle flashes from the stairwell as her backup engaged the assault team. The Russians had walked into a trap, but they were fighting with the desperate efficiency of men who knew capture meant life in federal prison. "Hawthorne!" she called out. "The drive!" "Here." He slid the flash drive across the oil-stained concrete, and Margaret snatched it up just as a black-clad figure appeared from behind a SUV. The Russian operative was everything the intelligence files had warned about. Tall, athletically built, moving with the fluid precision of Spetsnaz training. His weapon tracked toward Hawthorne with professional coldness, but Margaret was faster. Her first shot took him center mass, spinning him around. Her second shot ended the threat permanently. "One. Down," she reported, but even as she spoke, she could see 2 more figures advancing through the maze of parked cars. These men had been sent to eliminate every trace of the compromised operation, and they weren't leaving empty-handed. Hawthorne's panicked voice cut through the gunfire. "Director! Behind you!" Margaret spun to find herself face-to-face with a man who could have been carved from Siberian granite. Dmitry Volkov himself, the handler who'd run Hawthorne for 8 years, holding a pistol with the casual competence of someone who'd killed more people than she'd arrested. "Director Chen," he said in accented English, his weapon never wavering from her center mass. "You have caused considerable inconvenience." "Occupational hazard," Margaret replied, her own gun trained on his chest. They stood 15 feet apart. In a classic standoff, both professionals who understood that the first person to hesitate would be the first to die. "Give me the drive and perhaps you live to see your next birthday." "Counteroffer, surrender now, and I'll make sure you get 3 meals a day in federal lockup instead of a bullet in a DC alley." Volkov smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You Americans, always so confident in your moral authority. Do you know how many of your fellow agents are on Moscow's payroll? How many of your precious institutions we own? Fewer after today." The sound of combat boots on concrete echoed through the garage as FBI tactical teams swept the upper levels. Volkov's eyes flicked toward the sound, calculating odds and extraction routes with the speed of a man who'd survived decades in the intelligence underworld. "This is not over, Director Chen. You have won this battle, but the war continues. Russia has assets you cannot imagine, plans you cannot conceive. Maybe. But right now, you're surrounded by federal agents with really big guns and really bad attitudes." Margaret could see the exact moment when Volkov made his decision. His eyes hardened, his grip shifted slightly on his weapon, and she knew he was going to try to take her with him. She fired twice, fast and accurate, just as tactical teams burst through the stairwell entrance with overwhelming firepower. Volkov's shot went wide, sparking off concrete as he crumpled to the oil-stained floor. The garage filled with federal agents, tactical lights, and the organized chaos of a crime scene securing itself. Margaret safeguarded the flash drive and watched as EMTs worked frantically over Volkov's unconscious form. She needed him alive. He was the key to unraveling 8 years of Russian penetration into American intelligence. "Director!" Morrison appeared at her side, his face pale with adrenaline and relief. "Are you hit?" "Negative. But get me a secure line to the deputy director. We need to lock down every location on this drive before the Russians can warn their remaining assets." As federal agents processed the scene around her, Margaret found herself standing over Richard Hawthorne, who sat against a concrete pillar looking like a man reprieved from execution. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly. Margaret studied the man who'd called the police on her less than 24 hours ago for wearing a bathing suit in her own backyard. Racist, traitor, foreign intelligence asset, and now, potentially, the most valuable cooperating witness in a counterintelligence case that would reshape American national security. Now you spend the rest of your life making amends for 8 years of treason, she said. You'll testify against every asset on that drive, help us understand every operation you were part of, and pray that a federal judge believes your cooperation outweighs your crimes. And Patricia? Margaret's expression softened slightly. Your wife will be protected. She's innocent in this, and we don't punish family members for crimes they didn't commit. Relief flooded Hawthorne's face, followed immediately by shame. Director, I want you to know what I said yesterday about your neighborhood, about the way I spoke to you, was racist bullshit motivated by your own insecurities and prejudices? Margaret finished calmly. Don't try to blame your bigotry on Russian intelligence, Mr. Hawthorne. They recruited you for your access and your greed, not your personality defects. As FBI vehicles filled the parking garage and the largest counterintelligence roundup in Bureau history began to unfold, Margaret allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. Her peaceful weekend had been destroyed. Her quiet suburban anonymity was blown forever, and she'd nearly been killed by Russian assassins. But in the next 6 hours, federal agents would arrest 22 foreign intelligence assets across the D.C. area, seize millions in laundered funds, and prevent the compromise of classified operations that protected American lives around the world. Not bad for a weekend that had started with her neighbor calling the cops because he didn't like her bathing suit. Margaret's secure phone buzzed, with a call from FBI headquarters. Deputy Director Williams, probably having a heart attack over reports that his boss had just engaged in a firefight with Russian intelligence operatives in a shopping mall parking garage. Tom, she answered, before you start yelling, you should know that we just rolled up the largest Russian intelligence network on the East Coast. Jesus Christ, Margaret. When I told you to take the weekend off, I didn't mean you should start a shooting war with the SVR. Margaret looked around the garage, taking in the controlled chaos of federal agents securing evidence and processing suspects. Sometimes the job finds you, even when you're trying to relax. 3 hours later, as she finally returned to her house, now under permanent federal protection, Margaret found a handwritten note slipped under her front door. Director Chen, thank you for your service to our country and for standing up to hatred wherever you find it. We're proud to have you as our neighbor, the Kowalskis, 2 houses down. Margaret smiled as she crumpled the note, looking out at the quiet suburban street that would never be the same. Her cover was blown, her anonymity destroyed, but something else had taken their place. The recognition that integrity and courage weren't just professional requirements, but personal choices that defined who she was, both as FBI director and as a human being. Richard Hawthorne had called the police on her for wearing a bathing suit, never knowing he was targeting the one person with the authority and determination to destroy him completely. Sometimes karma wore a badge, and sometimes it came in a 2-piece swimsuit. The neighborhood would never be quite the same, but that was probably for the best. After all, Margaret Chen had never been the kind of person who blended into the background anyway. Justice, as it turned out, was the perfect accessory for any outfit. The summer sun blazed mercilessly as 17-year-old Marcus dove into the crystal-clear pool, unaware that in 20 minutes his life would explode into chaos. A woman's shrill voice would shatter the peaceful afternoon. "You don't belong here!" Security cameras would capture every venomous word, every cruel gesture. But what none of them knew, not the racist woman, not the stunned bystanders, not even Marcus himself, was that his mother's black sedan was already pulling into the parking lot. Governor Elena Washington had just finished a press conference about racial justice. She was about to get a masterclass in it. Marcus Washington adjusted his goggles and prepared for another lap, the chlorinated water of Sunset Ridge Community Pool shimmering like liquid diamonds beneath the scorching July sun. At 17, he moved through the water with the fluid grace of someone who'd been swimming since he could walk, each stroke cutting cleanly through the surface as other pool-goers lounged on deck chairs or splashed in the shallow end. "Looking good, Marcus," called out Jessica Chen, his teammate from Roosevelt High's swim team, who was timing his laps from the pool's edge. "Your butterfly stroke is getting insane." Marcus surfaced at the deep end, pushing wet curls back from his forehead as he caught his breath. "Coach Martinez wants me under 210 for the 200 fly before sectionals. I'm at 212 right now." "You'll get there," Jessica assured him, clicking her stopwatch. "Your mom's still coming to watch you at state if you qualify?" A smile spread across Marcus's face at the mention of his mother. "She promised she'd clear her whole schedule. You know how she is about keeping promises." What Jessica didn't know, what most of his friends didn't know, was exactly who his mother was. Marcus Washington went by his father's surname at school, a deliberate choice his parents had made to give him as normal a teenage experience as possible. While his classmates knew his mom worked in government, they had no idea that Elena Rodriguez Washington was the governor of their state, the first Latina woman to hold the office, elected on a platform of educational reform and social justice. The decision to keep his mother's identity private had been Marcus's own. He'd watched too many politicians' children struggle under the weight of constant scrutiny, their every mistake magnified, their achievements questioned as nepotism. He wanted to earn his way into Stanford on his own merit, to be judged by his character and accomplishments rather than his mother's political career. "One more set?" Jessica asked, checking her watch. "I can time you for another 200. Marcus nodded, pulling his goggles back down. The pool was getting busier as the afternoon wore on, families with young children claiming the shallow end, teenagers clustering around the diving board, elderly couples sharing a lane for their daily exercise. It was the kind of diverse, peaceful community scene that his mother often referenced in her speeches about the America she was working to build. As he prepared to dive in, Marcus caught sight of a woman he'd never seen before, making her way onto the pool deck. She was perhaps 50, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair that somehow remained unmoved by the humid air, wearing a crisp white cover-up over what looked like an expensive swimsuit. Designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and she carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed. She surveyed the pool area with obvious disdain, her gaze lingering disapprovingly on a group of laughing Latino children playing Marco Polo, then shifting to an elderly black man reading a newspaper in a lounge chair before finally settling on Marcus himself. Marcus felt a familiar prickle of unease, the sixth sense that every person of color develops, the ability to detect when they're being evaluated, measured, found wanting. But he pushed the feeling aside. This was Sunset Ridge, one of the most progressive communities in the state. His mother had specifically chosen their neighborhood for its reputation for inclusion and excellent schools. "Ready when you are," Jessica called out. Marcus dove cleanly into the water, his body cutting through the surface with barely a splash. The underwater world was his sanctuary, quiet, blue, peaceful. Here, nothing mattered except the rhythm of his strokes, the burning in his lungs that meant he was pushing his limits, the satisfying ache in his shoulders that came from proper technique. He surfaced for his first breath and saw the blonde woman, speaking animatedly to Harold Morrison, the pool manager. Harold was nodding, his face creased with what looked like confusion and concern. Marcus had known Harold for 3 years. The man had taught his little sister how to swim when she was afraid of the water, had always been nothing but kind and welcoming to every family who used the facility. Something was wrong. Marcus continued his set, but found his concentration wavering. Between breaths, he caught fragments of the conversation happening at the pool's edge. The woman's voice was getting louder, more insistent. Not supposed to be here. Check their membership status. Community standards. By the time Marcus completed his 200, touching the wall with his fingertips, Jessica's face had gone pale. "What's wrong?" he asked, pulling himself up onto the pool deck. Jessica glanced toward Harold and the blonde woman, then back at Marcus. "That lady, Karen Fletcher, I think someone called her, she's asking Harold to check if certain people are supposed to be here." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He followed Jessica's gaze and saw that Karen Fletcher was now pointing directly at him, her voice carrying clearly across the pool deck, despite her obvious attempts to speak quietly. "That boy, for instance. I've never seen him before. Are you sure he's a member? Because I am, and I pay good money for the privilege of using this facility. I expect certain standards to be maintained." The conversation around the pool began to die down as people became aware of the tension. Parents pulled their children closer. The elderly black man folded his newspaper and sat up straighter in his chair. Even the lifeguard on duty turned to watch, her whistle hanging forgotten around her neck. Harold Morrison ran a hand through his graying hair, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I've known Marcus for 3 years. His family has been members here since they moved to the neighborhood. He's one of our most dedicated swimmers, training for the state championships." "That's what they all say," Karen Fletcher replied, dismissively. "But I happen to know that this pool has had problems with outsiders sneaking in, using facilities they haven't paid for. And frankly, looking at him, I find it hard to believe his family can afford a membership here, the B." Words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Marcus felt every eye on the pool deck turn toward him, felt the weight of assumptions and prejudices that had nothing to do with who he was or what he'd accomplished. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "There's no problem here, Mrs. Fletcher," Harold said firmly. "Marcus is a member in good standing. His family's membership is up to date, and he has every right to use this facility." Karen Fletcher's face flushed red beneath her perfectly applied makeup. "Don't you dare take that tone with me. I've been a member of this community for 15 years. I volunteer for every charity event. I serve on the Homeowners Association board, and I will not be spoken to like some common troublemaker by someone who clearly doesn't understand the situation." She turned her attention directly to Marcus, her voice rising to carry across the entire pool area. "You, boy, I want to see your membership card, right now." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the pool's filtration system seemed to quiet, as if the very building was holding its breath. Marcus stood dripping on the concrete, 17 years old, and suddenly feeling like he was carrying the weight of every stereotype, every assumption, every moment of prejudice his parents had tried to shield him from. Jessica stepped closer to his side, her face flushed with anger. "This is crazy. Marcus, you don't have to—" "It's okay," Marcus said quietly, though his voice carried clearly in the still air. He reached for his pool bag and pulled out his wallet, extracting the membership card with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from rage held carefully in check. He held the card up for Karen Fletcher to see. "Here's my membership card. My family's name is on the account. We've been members for 3 years, like Harold said." Karen Fletcher snatched the card from his hand, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny. This could be fake, or borrowed, or stolen. Just because you have a card doesn't mean that's enough. The voice came from the pool's entrance, calm but carrying an unmistakable note of authority that made everyone turn. A woman in a crisp navy blazer and dark slacks was walking onto the deck, her heels clicking against the concrete. Even without the usual trappings of her office, the security detail, the press entourage, the formal podium, There was something about Elena Rodriguez Washington that commanded attention. Marcus's heart stopped. His mother surveyed the scene, with the same sharp intelligence that had made her one of the most effective governors in the country, taking in Harold's distressed expression, Jessica's protective stance beside Marcus, and Karen Fletcher still clutching his membership card, like evidence of some crime. "I was hoping to surprise my son after his swim practice," Elena said conversationally, her voice carrying the slight accent that became more pronounced when she was angry. "But it seems I've arrived at an interesting moment.